free. There we go. To make sure that you have the link to our YouTube channel. We're easy to find, Church of Christ at Dartmouth College on YouTube. And you can watch Brooks, you can watch Jim Antal, you can watch our weekly Green Team messages that various Green Team members make as part of our virtual worship service. So while people continue to join us, Brooks, I'm going to ask you to join in. So thank you so much for being here. We're thrilled you're here, and we're thrilled that we got a room full of people to talk to.
Great. Well, thank you so much, Rob, for having me. Thank you for the CCDC Green Team and Rob for making this possible, and delighted to see an ecumenical audience here tonight. You know, the title that I gave this is Becoming a Creation Justice Church, and so I just want people to know right off the bat, since we've got a ecumenical group here, is that the phrase creation justice actually has a very ecumenical origin. So around 2013, the National Council of Churches decided that they would spin off their environmental justice ministries. And so they did that. And when they spun off, they became known as Creation Justice Ministries, and an ecumenical group of Episcopalians, Lutherans, Disciples of Christ, United Church of Christ, American Baptist, AME Zion, and AME. All of them kind of got together and said, we like creation justice as a name for what we are and what we're about. And so over the course of this evening, I'll give a little bit more definition to that, but I just want you to know some of the ecumenical roots. And in fact, the American Baptists have a creation justice network. And so it's a good term that I'm fond of, and will be happy to share more about as we go. Just one housekeeping detail, Amanda and Rob, am I good to use PowerPoint? Is that okay? All right. And yeah, so basically, you know, what I really want to underscore tonight is what you all are doing in your respective churches and green teams just couldn't be more important. And so I hope that's something that comes across as just how vitally important and how much of a difference all of you make. And so you won't have to look at me for the next 20, 30 minutes. I'm going to switch to PowerPoint here.
Mandy, can you make Brooks a host? Because that will enable his PowerPointing.
Yes, I can, but it'll take me a split second.
All right, no problem.
Okay, sorry that I wasn't Johnny on the spot about that.
No, that's okay.
Please remind me how to do it.
Go down to participants,
Okay.
find Brooks's name, do the little pull down by Brooks's name, and it'll say make host.
Thank you, Rob. There you go. I'm changing the host. So you're the host now, Brooks.
Brooks is the host. Hooray.
Terrific. Thank you. Very generous. All right. All right. Thanks. Terrific. So just those of you who aren't UCC or maybe new to this know, in the UCC, what we call our Green Church program, we call it the Creation Justice Church program. And so, but I want you to think, you know, of this becoming a Creation Justice Church as not being like a church earning the equivalent of a Boy Scout or Girl Scout badge. I want to frame it as really something bigger than that. It's part of being a part of a larger transformative movement within the church, and part of the UCC heritage and the heritage of other churches, especially in the New England area, is the revivals of the Great Awakening. And I believe that you guys are all part of the revival of the next Great Awakening. We might call it the Green Awakening. And with the Great Awakening, some of you might remember Jonathan Edwards preached a famous sermon called Sinners in the Hands of an Angry God. So for this Green Awakening, perhaps we can talk about creation saints in the hands of an empowering God, or something a little more positive perhaps, and theologically more suited to our times. So let me just, there we go. So what I kind of want to say is that part of this Green Awakening is not so much becoming something new and different, but really awakening to our true nature and identity, the true nature and identity of our faith. And so, as we'll see, becoming a Creation Justice Church is really about becoming our fullest and best selves as a church. And tonight I want to dive into why that is and how that is. So why is becoming a Creation Justice Church part of becoming our truest and best self? It's because our first calling is to care for God's creation. Right there in the beginning of Genesis, the first purpose that God gives us as humans is to care for the garden, to care for creation. The biblical word for justice has the meaning of being in right relationship. And so creation justice is all about churches getting into right relationship with creation, with God, and with our fellow humans in this world that is so marred by violence and inequity. Creation justice is really central to our DNA as Christians. So becoming a Creation Justice Church is about realizing that and following through on the resulting implications. Because when something is a part of the core of who you are, then you start to bring it with you in all the areas and aspects of your life and all the areas and aspects of your ministry as a church. Ultimately, becoming a Creation Justice Church is fundamentally about discerning our calling. And oops, I go one too far. Discerning our calling. So how do we translate our original calling as people of faith into this world we live in today? One of my favorite quotes is this one by Friedrich Buechner: "The place God calls you to is the place where your deep gladness and the world's deep hunger meet." In many ways, how we discern our calling is an intersection between our joys, passions, and commitments, all those things that animate us, with the needs, hurts, and wrongs that exist in the world, and figuring out how we can make a difference as vessels of the love of Jesus out into the world. And so when it comes to the climate crisis today, there is certainly lots of need and lots of wrong to be addressed. And I believe that our faith has shaped us to meet this need. Churches possess some true gifts that are desperately needed to meet the situation our world finds itself in today. To be good stewards of creation means we have to be good stewards of the gifts that we possess. As 1 Peter says, like good stewards of the manifold grace of God, serve one another with whatever gift each of you has received. And toward that end, I want to offer to you 5 gifts that the church has to offer to this moment. The first gift that I believe we have to offer is that we are communities of solidarity. And there's an experience that I had actually in Atlanta a few years back. I went to Atlanta to attend a Methodist Creation Justice Conference, and they had us go on a tour of the Atlanta Green Beltway, which is basically an old railroad track line that's now been converted into a place where people love to walk and enjoy nature and a ring around the city. And so they took us on a tour of that. And while we were on that tour, we saw a enormous piece of artwork underneath an overpass. And there next to the artwork was the story behind this. And what happened was that a church had brought together people in the community to go out and clean up the streets of their community. And they did that, and they gathered all of the junk and the refuse. And then they had a professional artist work with the community and form it into a giant sculpture. And the sculpture formed basically the head or the face of a man named Tony. And the story about Tony was that he was someone that, as the placard said, had kind of lost his way, but then the community loved him back into being a whole, thriving, vibrant person again. And so the artwork captured that feeling of the church surrounding Tony. And not far from that sculpture, there was another work of art. It was kind of like a peace pole, and it had a saying written on it that is what I think captures this idea that our faith communities at their best are communities of solidarity. And what that pole said is, when an I is replaced by we, even illness becomes wellness. When an I is replaced by we, even an illness becomes wellness. And I think, isn't that the way the Spirit sometimes works in community? I would say that when the I becomes a we, it's not only a good opportunity for our human health, but it's also critical to restoring God's creation. And so we are communities that come together and know how to be together when we're operating at our best. And I think that's a real gift that we have to offer to the broader movement. Second gift, I want to, if I can get it to work here. There we go. Second gift, we are communities that know how to deal with grief. So for millennia, we have been in the business of dealing with grief and fear. Right? And climate change brings up a lot of grief and fear. Grief is about loss and grief. That's grief over what is already lost, but then there's also anticipatory grief over what will or might be lost. It's this impending sense of doom, the sense that there are storm clouds on the horizon. And that's a big part, I think, of what many experience today. And one can say that part of climate denialism today is our collective failure to come to terms with grief. Some of you may remember the stages of grief. Elizabeth Kubler-Ross, and one of them is denial. And so faith communities at their best recognize that faith isn't something that faith communities at their best realize that grief isn't something that can be evaded or denied. And one of my favorite kind of grief counselors as a pastor who kind of trained me in grief was a guy named Alan Wolfelt. He used to talk about grief as a forest, and you can't go over it, around it, or under it. You have to go through it. And when you go through it, the best way to go through it is by accompanying one another. And so I think faith communities can give that support to one another, and it's part of our heritage of how we live out our faith, is being that accompaniment and support as we go through the wilderness. A third gift, we are communities with a faith built for crisis. And in a sense, one can say that there is a long tradition of what you might call crisis theology, or what I would call kairos theology. Kairos is a word that appears some 80 times in the Second Testament. In Greek, the thing to know is that there's two words for time, kairos and chronos. Chronos is the ticking clock, and kairos is this idea of the right moment happening, the right action taking place at the right moment. So chronos is quantitative and kairos is more qualitative. And so the arrival of Jesus was the fulfillment at the right moment, at the right time, of God's love into this world. And so that word, it became significant over the course of time. Famous theologian Paul Tillich kind of became fixated on the word as he came out of being a chaplain in World War I and the trenches and the chaos that he saw. He became attracted to this, and what he realized is that Kairos is always paradoxically a moment that occurs in crisis, and it's also a moment of opportunity. And so Tillich would describe a Kairos moment as one in which the eternal breaks into the temporal, shaking and transforming it. And during the anti-apartheid movement, a group of laity and pastors and professors got together in Soweto during the peak of violence during apartheid, and they issued what became known as the Kairos document. And for them, Kairos meant that it was a moment of crisis, a moment of paradoxically of grace, but also a moment of truth in which the true nature of the church was revealed. The church had to take a side. And could no longer hide or sit on the fence. And one could say that today we are facing a time in which the church can no longer hide or sit on the fence, but is compelled to take a side and to take action. Martin Luther King Jr. as well described Kairos as a moment in which history is pregnant, ready to give birth to a great idea and a great movement. And so we have this whole theological tradition of people wrestling with what it means to be in a moment of crisis and how God becomes active in those moments, shaking and transforming them, as Paul Tillich said. A fourth gift, we are communities of thanksgiving. And so, I've named that our gifts are our capacity for dealing with grief and crisis, but we're not just the spiritual equivalent of the emergency ambulance. Part of coming together for worship every week is Thanksgiving. And something that captures the significance of this for those who are engaged in the environmental justice movement is something that was said by a French Catholic priest who was, up until his death in 2007, Father Pierre was kind of one of the foremost champions for the homeless in France. And something that he once said is that we must always keep both eyes open, one eye on the world's suffering so that we can fight against it, and the other on its wondrous beauty so that we can give thanks for it. And so it's seen with both eyes wide open that we're able to sustain ourselves through times of struggle. And then a fifth gift that I believe faith communities bring is that we're communities that articulate what most fundamentally moves people to act. And in something that, that for me, what I think often what animates many of us boils down really to love of creation, love of neighbor, and love of children in particular. We know that among Christians, there's been surveys that tell us that even above caring for God's creation, what motivates Christians to take action on climate is that people are very much concerned for the world that their children and grandchildren are inheriting. And so love is always central to what I think animates many of us. And for us as Christians, it's love is synonymous with God, and so it's in enacting love that we become vessels of God, and that I think is part of our calling today as Christians. And so, what does it mean to be a Creation Justice Church? And here is where I kind of want to shift from being more of a monologue to a dialogue, and just talk about these four dimensions and invite all of you to tell me your thoughts as we go along here. So those of you who maybe have looked at the process of becoming a Creation Justice Church in the United Church of Christ will be aware of these four dimensions. And the way our process works is that it's not so much a prescription that you do X, Y, and Z. and that makes you a Creation Justice Church. It's that you go through a process of discernment and asking yourselves questions and finding the answers to those questions through discerning God's presence in your church and how to make a difference in the world around you. And so, so we'll take a look at these 4 dimensions, and in the process, I'll share with you the discernment questions that come with each dimension. And so the first dimension is theology and worship, viewing theology and worship as kind of foundational to who we are as Christians and as the starting point. And so the questions for discernment here are, how can your congregation intentionally reflect upon God in relationship to caring for creation? How can it bring theological understandings of creation care and justice into its services of worship? And so I think that's kind of a starting point for conversation. I open things up just to hear reflections from all of you as to how you reflect on theology and worship in relationship to creation care and creation justice.
And at this point, people can feel free to just unmute and give a shout when you have a question or you have a statement. So we are a small enough group so you can just jump right in.
Brooks, I loved hearing you mention Paul Tillich, and the ground of our being that seems somehow to relate here to how we might be thinking about this process. Just a thought.
How would you see the ground of being? I can see there courage being an essential part. What connections are you making there?
Our relatedness as people, the grounding in our faith and in the natural world, and the sense of the unity in creation, and our responsibility therefore.
Nice, I like that. Appreciate it. Great. Other thoughts and reflections?
Well, we've had Rob, this is Gail, we've had Rob, you know, and Mandy both regularly giving worship sermons that include taking care of the earth and creation justice. So
Some would say too frequently.
that's been going on for about 2 years. I think it's just right. And actually in Sunday school, you know, for a good 5 years, we talk this a lot about with the children. It's something they can really relate to, you know, recycling and, you know, saving energy at their homes. And they talk about things they're doing. And so, you know, I think we've been working on that for a long time.
5 years ago, we went through a fairly thorough process of discernment in looking at our church covenant, which, you know, being a UCC church is a fairly foundational document. And at that point, we added to our covenant a phrase to restore and protect all of creation. And so now every week when we recite our covenant, and soon we'll be singing our covenant, we have that as a base theological part of our self-identity.
Great, perfect. I like that. Nice.
I think I'll jump in. I think I was in high school when I went to, it might have been the New Hampshire conference, and I heard Jim Antel. And that's when, I don't remember anyone else really at this conference except for him. And he stood out to me because he talked about, like, for me, it was really revolutionary, I guess, because he talked about preaching on climate, like, every week. And he's like, you can't not do it. Like, I tell everyone preaching that you have to make at least like 3 out of the 4 per month sermons on climate. And that I just took that and like totally remembered it. And like, it changed my view of how the church can think about and like be in conversation with climate. So I never think there's too much. And I really appreciate Rob really taking that to spirit as well.
Great. Thanks.
Brooks, I don't think she's referring to the climate summit we had a couple of years ago in Manchester when you were also there. So
I'm not offended if she is. That's okay.
I believe, Katie, that was the one at Old South Church in Boston, where we had a wonderful ecumenical Massachusetts climate gathering.
Great.
Well, I don't want this to be completely dominated by clergy or Green Team members, but I do think one of the other ways that we can is that we are always referring to creation in the liturgy, even if we're not preaching about the environmental crisis or how we need to step up, that our hymns that we use, that the prayers that we use, that the ways in which we shape worship ought to be inclusive of these issues all the time.
Right. Yeah, if you think about it, every moment of our lives, we can give thanks for the gifts of God's creation, right? The air and water and so forth. And so it's in one way, it's always right there ready for those prayers of thanksgiving and liturgies of thanksgiving, I think, too, as well. I think there's so many different ways churches can incorporate creation justice into their worship and theological life. There's a church, UCC Church in Weybridge, and they have a creation justice moment in every worship service. And we've had some members of the UCC Council for Climate Justice taken upon themselves to write Kairos moments that churches can use in worship. And one thing that I'll say too is that for whatever reason, the ELCA, the Lutherans and the Presbyterians and the Episcopalians, generally speaking, seem to have latched on more to something called the season of creation. And that is to create a whole new liturgical season focused on creation care and justice. And so that runs from, I believe, September 1st to October 4th or so. And it's been endorsed by the World Council of Churches. So it's not just some kind of fringe thing, but it's people really believe that part of our yearly liturgical should be a focus on creation. And so so that's there's lots of ideas out there, and I think it's there's room for more innovation as well. So great. I'm gonna move us along to the next area, dimension of becoming a Creation Justice Church, which is institutional life and practice. And something I'll say here. So here are the questions for discernment that one can reflect upon in relation to this. How can your congregation integrate care for creation into the life and work of its ministry teams, committees, and governing council? How can your congregation embody care for creation through its building and land use policies and practices? And so here again, I think it's just important to remember, when you begin with the idea that caring for God's creation is central to our calling and DNA as Christians, then it makes sense that we should be bringing this into all of the aspects of our church life. When I was a pastor, I used to think about it, with every group I would meet with, and I always thought, well, even our prayer shawl knitting ministry, right? They can use organic yarn, right? You can always find something, and so and with each of these things, as part of the process for going, the resources that we put together in the United Church of Christ to help churches become a Creation Justice Church, for each dimension, we have a resource page of ideas. And one of the ideas put out here is for churches to do kind of a green church inventory and to list all of the committees and ministries. And I'll never forget when I was in Wisconsin a year ago, and I mentioned that idea, and everybody, rolled their eyes and said, no way, because their church had 52 committees. And so, but I don't know if too many churches have that many committees, but that's, yeah. But I think it does stand, true, that this is something really for everybody to reflect upon there. So any thoughts or responses as you think about that in relationship to the life of your church?
Well, I think Steve Shadford should talk about the building, but I'm on Congregational Life, and we are in charge of coffee hour, and we have been struggling a little bit with all the waste that we create, even with recycled plastic cups, which maybe aren't even recyclable anymore. How to balance health safety if we use like real cups and then have to wash them afterwards so that they're sanitized enough to use. Is that more economical than, using plastic things that we're going to throw away and hopefully recycle? So, we have, been struggling with a little bit of just those practical things. How many times do committees meet and use that, maybe throw away, if not recyclable stuff? It's a minor issue, but it really adds up over a year's time of use.
Yeah, no, it's it can seem like a minor issue, but it is significant, and it's significant for many churches. At our last General Synod in the United Church of Christ, we actually had a resolution from a Pennsylvania conference, calling for an end to styrofoam use in church. And so. And it was really, quite compelling that this is part of our everyday life, and it's actually, in that sense, a really good place to begin, by looking at the things that we use every day. And so it can be a good educational opportunity for a church kind of beginning the ladder of engagement on this. And so, and there's always creative things to do there. There's churches that have done let's bring your own mug to church, whatever the acronym is for that. I definitely, affirm you and support you, and because I know that can be an issue to wrestle with, who's going to wash the dishes and that kind of thing. So it's a real issue.
Brooks, that's one of the things that our church started with, maybe because it is one of the simpler things to attack and it's quite visible. But mugs and cloth napkins and getting rid of the plastic stirrers, getting out some real silverware. You do have the issue of cleaning up, but that seemed like that, and ordering coffee and tea that were fair trade, that kind of stuff. That and then the building itself, button up type of things, changing the lights. That was kind of our starting point. But then we branched out into other things.
Steve, could you talk a little bit about the lights?
Years ago, we switched the lights to CFLs in most of the building, and got a grant from PSNH at the time to help swap out all the fluorescent tubes and that kind of thing. And now we're going through it again this year, switching them to LEDs. Never really done.
Great, good. Yep, those are important things. I'm glad you're undertaking them, and sometimes utilities can be a good source of, they can have special programs to help make those transitions. Right.
There it is.
And just beyond buildings and grounds issues, I think it's it's also these questions can be asked of Christian education ministries. It can be asked of churches that have endowments, their endowment committees. It can be a time to consider divestment from fossil fuels. And so Jim Antal, of course, was a champion of that in our denomination. when we passed a resolution calling for divestment in 2013. And so definitely a source of UCC heritage there, and where we've taken stands. Right.
Brooks,
Yeah.
I speak up here. This is Lee.
Go for it.
I was hoping that Marge would take it a step further, because I believe her church has actually gone much further than this with establishing a community solar situation where they're using church land and buildings in order to make solar power available to low-income communities.
Lee, that's partly right. We're not doing the community power thing, but we have put PV on one of the church-owned buildings, the one that was best suited for putting panels on top. And it's enough to, it was sized so that it would be enough electricity for the 3 buildings we own, the church, the parsonage, and the community house. So in that sense, it's kind of like a group community power, but it's all our own.
And that's terrific, but it does at least show that there's an opportunity to go beyond that and be a center for community action also. It's not always available. We don't always have that amount of land or that amount of resources, but where it is possible, I think it's something that we can all strive towards.
Could I ask Susan Fuller to jump in here briefly and talk a little bit about the Solar Saints?
Sure. Thank you, Rob. Yes. So Solar Saints is a group. I'm in the Episcopal Church, and we actually just had a meeting earlier this week to review some sustainability grants. And Solar Saints is a group that produced a resolution at our convention last year that churches would commit to reducing their carbon footprints by at least 30%. And so we've been working with them to help them work with their utilities, which have, will give, will share some of the expenses of upgrading your lighting and other efficiency projects in your church. And then the diocese also has funds that they are helping churches. And so we had 5 wonderful grants that we're recommending funding be approved for. So that's an exciting project that Solar Saints is involved in.
Great. Well, it sounds like your churches are doing some wonderful things. Before we transition to the next dimension, I'll just mention a couple of other ideas that I sometimes highlight. First is that churches, there's the EPA, it's still part of the EPA, despite the current administration, has a program for Energy Star congregations. And basically, Energy Star is if you go to Home Depot or wherever you see it on appliances, right? There it signifies appliances that are energy efficient, but there's also, you can get a plaque, an award for becoming a Energy Star building or an Energy Star faith community. And so they offer really the best online program for monitoring one's energy use from month to month. And then benchmarking oneself in relationship to buildings of equivalent size. And so that's something that a fair number of our churches have done, and it gives something to take pride in. And then the other thing I'll mention is that out of the Standing Rock movement, one of our churches in the Seattle area, as city councils across the nation were thinking about where they were investing their money or banking their money, they asked themselves, well, in addition to divesting, an endowment, really every church banks their money, and some of these banks, were financing pipelines like the DAPL or Keystone, and so they said, well, we don't want to bank anymore with I think for them it was Wells Fargo, and so they pulled their money out of Wells Fargo, and they found a local credit union with which to bank, I believe. And so that's another way in which churches can take financial action, because not every church has an endowment fund, right? But we all have bank accounts. So move next to let's see, the next area if it comes for me. Let's see. There we go. Dimension 3, circles of awareness and advocacy. And here is where I encourage churches to think of themselves as a dot amid concentric circles that keep on going outward. And so I think, in the past, a tendency for green church programs was to focus almost exclusively on the internal life of the church. It's great to focus on changing light bulbs and recycling and so forth, but really as Christians, ultimately we're called to go beyond the walls of the church. And that means often expanding our circles of awareness and advocacy. And just to give it, an example of the significance of that is, right, when we plug into, an outlet at the church, that electricity comes from someplace, and sometimes that electricity has really substantial harm and impact on particular communities, right? So we know that coal plants in the United States, low-income communities of color are much more likely to be located near coal plants, right? And coal plants, have all sorts of harms, whether you're talking about mercury impacting, a fetus or a newborn baby, whether you're talking about neurological damage, whether you're talking about heart and lung diseases. There's all sorts of things that are impacts of where we get our energy from often. And so just kind of connecting the dots and being aware of things beyond the walls of the church, really, and the justice concerns beyond the walls of the church. And so that can go to the local community, to the state, to the nation, and really ultimately globally. So just some questions for discernment here, with particular attention to socioeconomic factors such as race, class, and global inequality. How can your congregation research and inform itself about environmental justice issues at the local, state, national, or global levels? How can this awareness correspond to congregational advocacy and action? And so I just want to leave those, put those questions out there to see what your thoughts are as far as how congregations can expand their circles of awareness and advocacy.
I'll just say that our green team, this is Gail again, our green team has been forming networks with a local 350.org and the New Hampshire Interfaith Power and Light. And there's another one that Katie knows, New England, Renew New England.
Oh, yeah.
So yeah, we're trying to get networked in with some of these other organizations that are working on the climate crisis, so that we can then expand from once we become our Creation Justice Church and be ready to go.
Gail, what was your first one? Could you say your first one again?
350.org.
350.org, which is a
Thank
big,
you.
it's the
Okay,
group Bill
thanks.
McKimmon, but there's actually an Upper Valley group starting up. So that's one thing. Katie Ammon's been very active on that, as has Lydia Hansberry.
Yeah, so it's actually 350 New Hampshire, which is separate from 350.org, so it's a little different, but They have a similar mission and values, but they're just in the state, and then 350 New Hampshire's chapters throughout the state, and 350 Upper Valley is our specific chapter. And I work with both the state organization and then 350 Upper Valley, which is under that umbrella. And then Renew New England is essentially like a Green New Deal for the New England states, and each state has their own plan. And so I've been working to bring all of that to the Green team, and then we signed on to the Renew New England initiative as a team, to just add context to that.
Two other organizations that I'd like to make people aware of. One is CCL, which stands for Citizens Climate Lobby. They're working to implement carbon pricing because especially carbon fee and dividend, where the money comes back to people, that would help us make a quicker switch to clean energy, at the same time protecting people economically. And the other group is the Environmental Voter Project, which is really important, especially in election years. There are millions of people in this country who have been identified as concerned about the environment, and yet they do not vote. And so this project is not trying to persuade anyone about a particular candidate. They're just trying to get these people to the polls.
And I'll just mention that through the UCC Council for Climate Justice, we have partnerships with both 350 and the Environmental Voter Project. With 350, a few years ago, we encouraged church green teams to consider becoming 350 affiliates. And then with the Environmental Voter Project, we initiated something called the Creation Care Voter Pledge, which is which we do with the Environmental Voter Project. Similar to their pledge, what they do is they track over 5,000 elections every year in the United States. And so when someone takes the Creation Care Voter Pledge to vote their values consistently in each election, then the Environmental Voter Project helps us out by sending out reminders to those people that they have a local or state election coming up. And so they've been a great partner for us, and we now have a group of 20 or so UCCers that as a group do text banking for the Environmental Voter Project. They text potential environmental voters often in swing states and other states to encourage them to vote every time an election comes up. And so we've really enjoyed our partnership with them, and hope to continue to see it grow. So.
This is Mandy from the Church of Christ at Dartmouth College. I think there's also, when I look at this question about socioeconomic factors and race, class, and global inequality, it's makes me think back to your earlier question about how we engage other committees in our church, not just the stewardship committee or the green team, but we do a Christmas market with a difference where we are engaged with between 30 and 50 fair trade organizations all over the world, and provide an opportunity for them to sell their creations. And I think it's important to think about what, every year we lose a group and gain another group, and to have that be at the heart of what we're asking. Are you not only doing economic empowerment in your community, but where are you at in terms of what you're doing with the materials? And that's part of, if you look at the groups that we work with, a lot of them are recycling and reusing. And so that's been at the heart of part of this movement that's been going on at the Church of Christ at Dartmouth College for over 30 years. And so you wouldn't initially think, Christmas presents and climate change and global inequality, or trying to address that. And yet it's a way in which this church has tried to be faithful across the board.
Certainly, great. Good example. I like how you're bringing the creation justice lens to that. Great. Other thoughts or reflections before we move on to our fourth and final dimension?
Brooks, if I could just give a shout out to an organization that just unfortunately folded, the United Valley Interfaith Project. for years has been going on a weekly basis down to Concord and standing and bearing witness and carrying placards, having prayer vigils, which make it very clear to every legislator walking into the building that there's a moral connection that they need to be cognizant of, and that people are there holding them accountable. Unfortunately, it's not been sustained, but perhaps it can be brought back. But I think many of the organizations that are here on this Zoom were part of that.
And I'd like to add to that, because I don't think United Valley has folded so much as there's a possibility of evolving in connection with Granite State organizing, which would allow us to introduce climate with a focus of connecting with the migrant justice issues and broadening our outreach at a state level.
Well, that's a very good, thank you so much for sharing that. That's very optimistic and empowering.
Yeah, I'm very hopeful for that connection, and our green teams can help facilitate that. Thank you.
Great. Well, good to hear those important efforts are continuing. All right. So the fourth and final dimension for Creation Justice churches here is connections to a broader movement, and this really, builds off of dimension number 3. That really this comes down to forming relationships, and so I apologize with this ecumenical audience. This is the language here is a little UCC centric, but really. So the way the questions here read, within the UCC, what are the ways in which your church can connect with others, whether it is through a conference task force, a UCC campground, the UCC's environmental justice newsletter, other points of contact? And then outside of the UCC, what are ways in which your church can connect with interfaith, ecumenical, or secular partners engaged in environmental justice work? And so, yeah, so those, I would love to hear your thoughts and responses to those questions of discernment.
I personally love to hear you talking about the ecumenical connections and valuing that, because it seems like that is so important in our world today, that we work cooperatively and not competitively, because part of what we're dealing with is competitiveness and equal equity in the allocation of resources in a meaningful way. So I'm delighted to see that you're having that as an important part of the creation justice discernment process.
Well, I think within churches and beyond churches and our ecumenical relationships, really what better commonality and common ground do we have than the very ground we stand on? And so, we share all these things in common, and so it should really be an easy cause for us to unite around.
Most churches have some kind of mission group that will set up what they're going to support monetarily for the year. So sometimes that can be, some environmental group or some project that needs support. We can do the 350newhampshire.org, or Nature Conservancy is also in New Hampshire. There are several, Sierra Club, whatever, the group decides they want to support. And we do that also at the conference level, and the Environmental Justice Mission Group also will support an organization if we find out information. We try to be local, but we will also do national or international if there's a need, especially after a disaster or anything like that, natural disaster, that we in this country have most likely contributed to.
Great.
Thinking of secular partners, I was thinking of town committees and projects that maybe schools are working on for thinking about their impact on climate. And it's an important way for members of congregations to reach out to other existing groups that are already there in the towns and cities. We have no cities per se, but to spread the word and bring wisdom.
There was also last January, Susan, a really great ecumenical experience that was offered at the UU Church, where a number of UCC and Episcopal and other members from different congregations got together to talk about. Jay Mantel was a speaker at that, so we're fortunate to have him in the area. But some other people talked a lot about what was happening in their towns and in their select boards, and that was really encouraging to hear that it was broader and deeper as we gathered together as an ecumenical group.
That's a really good point in terms of how the church can somehow connect with schools without, that sort of conflict that we have. Because I remember back in the 70s when recycling was big, the schools really took that on in a big way, that whole recycle, reuse, whatever, the 3 R's, and helped get a lot of not only recycling centers started, but recycling in the schools that is still pretty much ongoing. And then there's the whole farm to school movement too, in terms of growing food, lots of community gardens right at the school. So those are really ways that we could probably find other ways for education for kids and, expand that knowledge.
We have some teachers in our congregation who have actually put forth curriculum. They're both retired, but they have gone to the school system in our area and have offered the curriculum and asked the science teachers if they would be interested, or history, or whoever wanted to, take it on. And they had a very positive response for, age appropriate lessons on climate change, global warming, various subjects related around the environment. So anyone who's got teachers in your congregation could possibly do that if that was their passion.
And some of the towns are taking real innovative efforts. I think, Susie, you were involved when our town started sustainability and environmental recycling back ages ago. Am I right?
Yeah.
Yep.
Yeah.
And so how one community can learn from another, and particularly when they're ecumenical involvements and across the river involvements.
Well, I like hearing about working with schools. I think that's a really exciting, actually, venue. Just a couple small things that I did in this past year with a couple of faith-based town halls. We did a town hall with Senator Sherrod Brown and a town hall with Congresswoman Barbara Lee. And in both cases, we connected with youth groups or high school groups, and then gave the privilege of the first questions to be asked of Senator Sherrod Brown and Congresswoman Barbara Lee to representatives from those high school groups. And they brought a lot of great energy and sharpness to their questions. And as a result of that, this past week, this high school climate justice team sent out an e-blast to the entire school district, all the parents and teachers and everything, where they highlighted in the United Church of Christ's most recent environmental justice report, and they lifted that up as a reason to vote one's values. And so that was kind of neat to see a high school group doing that, and so that was really great, and just a small relationship was something that to build upon there. So, are there any other thoughts or reflections before we wrap things up?
I'd like to just say something.
Yeah.
This is Maureen Hall. I'm the one without the picture. Anyway, I've loved hearing everything that you folks are doing and know is being done. It's been a wonderful program. There's one thing that I'd like to just though emphasize in my own work, that power of prayer. And that God does the leading and the providing and the strength and courage and what all it takes to keep going. That the power of prayer is very basic to getting things done.
Amen. I appreciate that.
And that's said by a lady who's gotten a lot of things done over the years.
All right.
Amen.
Great. Great. Terrific. Yeah, you're a living example. Terrific. All right. I just want to, just the final slide here is for further resources, and in a second I'll just cut and paste all of the links here. So I'll share with you the website for our Creation Justice Churches program. Then also the Kairos call to action. The council that Rob is a member of, the Council for Climate Justice, at the beginning of this year issued a Kairos call to action declaring that the next 10 years are a time of crisis and opportunity, and so encouraging churches to develop 10-year action plans to address climate and inequality. And really it's an effort that mirrors and actually grew out of the United Church of Christ resolution in support of the Green New Deal. When we had a webinar with the executive director for the Sunrise Movement, we asked her what churches can be doing to support the Green New Deal, and she said, well, just as we call upon our government to have an all-out mobilization to address climate and inequality, we call upon all organizations and institutions to do an all-out mobilization over the next 10 years to address climate and inequality. And so, so the council and their wisdom came up with ideas for how churches can plan to make the most of the next 10 years in taking action. And so there's 10 ideas there as part of the Kairos call to action, if you're looking for some ideas. And then there's the Pollinator newsletter for the sharing of best practices and ideas and inspiration among churches, so that we can all be learning from each other. Because in order to have fruit, you have to have cross-pollination, right? And so, so we want that to be a place for churches to share. And whenever a church does something new and innovative or just really done really well, I encourage churches to write about it so they can share that with other churches and become a model for other churches. So, and then finally, every month I do a webinar with the Reverend Michael Malcolm, who is based in Birmingham, Alabama. He's the director of Alabama Interfaith Power and Light. And so we do monthly webinars where we have everyone from the climate scientist, Catherine Hayhoe, to authors, theologians, and we had Senator Cory Booker and others on there. So it's always a fun time and an enriching time. We have that each month. And so I'll put links to all of that here, and I'll bring my PowerPoint to a close. I'm happy to stick around and chat some more or have questions, conversation, whatever you like to do. But thank you for having me.
I would probably be remiss if I didn't mention this one thing. If it's okay if I add one more, about a minute long. I live in Vermont, and Hartford, Vermont has started this really, I don't know how it's going to work out. It's a really messy project, but it's been a really good idea of getting people to compost. And so at our local recycling center, we have these big bins where you can bring your compost as often as you wish for free to dump your compost that doesn't go into the landfill, or they're doing a lot of teaching webinars and, workshops on how to compost in your own backyard, which is hard if you don't really have the facility. But that's maybe something our church could get involved in, because we have beautiful gardens, and we could at least compost what we do at coffee hour. So that's another area that is really local and kind of easy to do for everybody.
Great. And Bob Shore-Goss, who's out there in New Hampshire, has written theological reflections on composting. So
okay.
Yeah, it's a great idea.
Bob sends his regrets tonight. He is on a 24-hour study leave, but knew that as long as Marge was here, we would be in good hands. I have one or two things. I would like to, Nancy Whiteman, what church do you represent? Are you still with us? Okay, I was hoping to get to our eighth faith group represented, and I would like to just briefly ask.
Participant at the Meriden Congregational Church.
Oh, she's Meriden. Okay, good. Well, Meriden is very well represented, and Meriden also, in the last month or so, has had at least 10 or 15 members take the Interfaith Power and Light Climate Voter Pledge. And Katie Amon is going to do a brief filibuster on that. In the spirit of ecumenism, we have a number of overlapping voter awareness things. And Katie and Gail are part of our local team talking about the IPL pledge. So Katie, could you give a brief infomercial?
Yeah, so New Hampshire Interfaith Power and Light is part of a national call from Interfaith Power and Light to basically distribute something called the Faith Voter Climate Pledge. And as actually some of you have touched on already, we know that people who care about climate don't always go out and vote. So this is a way to get people who have a value system and are really feel strongly about voting for our climate to sign this pledge, basically saying you will support candidates who are supporting climate-friendly policies. And it doesn't say anything about who you have to support, but it's just to get people out there and then remind them that, like, please vote. And this is a plug because September 8th we have our New Hampshire primary coming up. So I will drop the link for this pledge and in the chat, and also they have a nice little guide to tell you like what the values are through NHIPL. So it would be really great to have everyone tonight sign on and then tell 2 to 3 of your friends about it and really get this relational organizing and spread it through. Because as we know, the September election is a big deal for New Hampshire, and then the November election is really important for climate. So yeah, I've pledged, Gail has pledged, some of our green team has pledged, but would love to see you all pledging. Yeah, thanks.
Katie, thank you. And great thanks to Brooks. An investment of your time at the end of a long day. We are really grateful. And we are hoping, just as you've said, to keep this moving forward. You mentioned at the end of your book that this is a Pentecost moment, a chance to remake ourselves, a chance to take this moment, this Kairos moment, and in the midst of necessary concern about the pandemic and necessary concern about racial justice. Jacob Blake's name is on all of our minds tonight, and in our grief about that. But the fact is that underlying it all is a concern for this crisis of climate, and the fact that churches are and should be the instruments of change. So Brooks, thank you so very much. We promise to keep you posted and let you watch as the number of Creation Justice churches goes. from 1 to 4 to 8. We will, Gail's got her hand up. Go ahead, please.
To give a shout out to Brooks and the webinars that he's done. You can watch all of the past ones through the website, and I've watched quite a few, and I've participated in quite a few, and they've just been incredibly informative, and the speakers have been wonderful. So I know a lot of people are spending a lot of time watching various webinars and Zooms, but I highly recommend them.
Thanks.
I'd like to close tonight in honor of Maureen Hall with a brief prayer. I would love to have you all be with me in a spirit of prayer. Holy One, we are grateful. We are grateful for the beauty and complexity and fragility of your creation. And we are grateful that you have gathered us tonight and will continue to gather us so that we can become the disciples who walk in your ways and help preserve this creation for generations yet to come. We ask that you bless this work, that you bless this gathering, and that you watch over all of your creation. In the name of your Son, our Savior. Amen. Thank you all. A wonderful evening, Brooks.
Thank you. Thank you, Rob.
Thank you.
Yeah, thanks, everyone.
Thanks.
You'll be hearing from us all. Thank you.
Okay, sounds good.
Thank you.
Great evening. Greeting from Florida. I hope
Thank you so much.
Thank you, Emily and
Meeting.
Bruce.
Hi, Katie. It's Emily from the
Oh,
pool.
hi.